news tonight, His Majesty holds talks in Kosovo, a country of Muslim majority, on ways to enhance bilateral ties and cooperation, especially in the fight against terror and promoting the values of moderation. President Vladimir Putin vows to punish those responsible for bringing down a Russian airliner over Sinai after proof of a bomb attack, and Russian forces intensify airstrikes against Daesh in Syria. And France continues raiding properties in the hunt for accomplices to Friday's Paris attacks, and the French presidency says François Hollande is to hold talks in Washington and Moscow next week. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. His Majesty King Abdullah said the world is facing another world war and that there must be a swift response to the threats posed by Daesh and other such groups. His Majesty spoke at a meeting with the President of the Republic of Kosovo, Atifete Yahyaga, to discuss bilateral ties and ways to enhancing cooperation between the two countries, especially in the war against terror. The meeting focused on steps by Jordan and Kosovo, a country with a Muslim majority, to spread the values of tolerance and moderation while rejecting all forms of radicalism. His Majesty and Yahyaga also reviewed efforts to realize Palestinian-Israeli peace and resolve the Syria crisis. King Abdullah received the Medal of Independence in honor of his peace efforts worldwide. Here's an excerpt of His Majesty and Yahyaga's remark to the media.
Today, we stand proud as a young nation, rebuilding our society, committed to further our values of freedom and democracy, of peace and tolerance. These are values that we promote, and we look to Jordan as an ally in this. As the President of Kosovo, I am outraged by the brutal terrorist attacks in Paris and saddened by the loss of so many innocent lives. We have all been affected because this was not an attack on Paris. This was an attack on all of the freedom-loving countries around the world, on values and liberties that are fundamental to humanity and fundamental to the society that I represent. Defeating these terrorist networks is a challenge that cannot be met but by one nation alone. It is imperative that we dedicate to it the attention and the necessary resources to destroy it, to permanently defeat it. Kosovo will continue to show this determination at home. We will not be a safe haven or a transit route for these elements, and we will continue to work with our partners and international security organization to further address this matter. Your Majesty, as I have said in our joint meeting today, Kosovo is on the right side of the history. We will guard these values, and in light of the dark forces that want to encroach these hard-won freedoms and liberties.
It is also, for me, a pleasure to be in this country that plays such an important role in stability in this region, and many of us around the world will continue to support Kosovo and its rights for the future of its people and the important role it continues to play. So you will always count on my support and the support of my country in that role. It is also important because this is a country in Europe with a Muslim majority at a time when both Europe and Islam are under attack from terrorists. Kosovo reflects the best values of tolerance and coexistence. These are the values we must build on and promote to counter the barbarism committed in Paris last week. The atrocious Paris attack shows the scourge of terrorism can strike anywhere and at any time. Groups such as Daesh expose themselves daily as savage outlaws of religion, devoid of humanity, respecting no laws and no boundaries. As I told Her Excellency, We are facing a third world war against humanity, and this is what brings us all together. This is a war, as I've said repeatedly, within Islam. And unfortunately, over 100,000 Muslims have been murdered by Daesh alone over the past 2 years. And that doesn't also count for the atrocities that like-minded groups have also done in Africa and Asia. So therefore, we must act fast and holistically to tackle and respond to the interconnected threats, whether it is in this region, Africa, Asia, or in Europe. We look to your country as a key partner in this joint response to extremist threats that face the globe.
Separately, His Majesty discussed with Kosovo Prime Minister Isa Mustafa prospects of broadening bilateral cooperation, namely in the economic sectors. They urged the exchange of visits between Jordanian and Kosovan businesses to explore investment opportunities in both countries. Areas of future cooperation include exchanges in the area of medical tourism and pharmaceuticals, as well as experience sharing in the e-health program Hakim. On the sidelines of his Kosovo visit, King Abdullah visited the National Art Gallery, founded in 1979 as a cultural institution to preserve and collect historic and valuable works of art. The art gallery was named after one of the most prominent Kosovan artists of all times, Muslim Mulliki. His Majesty toured the exhibits, including works by local and international artists. Russian President Vladimir Putin has vowed to hunt down the terrorists responsible for a Russian airliner crash over Sinai Peninsula earlier this month, after Moscow concluded that it was indeed a bomb that brought down the plane, killing all 224 people. He said Russian Air Force's military work in Syria must not only be continued, it must be intensified in such a way that the criminals understand the retribution is inevitable.
We should not apply any time limits. We should know them all by name. We will search for them everywhere, wherever they are hiding. We will find them in any spot of the planet and punish them.
Egypt offered its cooperation with Russia to end terrorism and increase international cooperation, according to government statement that came after the Kremlin's confirmation it was a terror attack on the Russian airliner. Egyptian Interior Minister said if security lapses occurred, those responsible would be punished, although the Civil Aviation Authority said the investigation committee has not yet found any evidence of criminal action in the plane crash. Russia, meanwhile, was stepping up airstrikes against Daesh in Syria with long-range bombers and cruise missiles targeting Aleppo and Idlib. The Russian Air Force carried out around 2,300 sorties in Syria in the last 48 hours and plans to bolster its strike force, which consists of around 50 planes and helicopters with a further 37 aircraft. The Kremlin said in a separate statement that Putin and French President François Hollande had spoken on the phone and agreed to boost coordination of their military action in Syria. French warplanes were also reported to have targeted Raqqa for a second day. As part of action by the international community in the fight against Daesh, the French presidency said François Hollande will travel to Washington and Moscow next week to discuss the fight against the terrorist group and the situation in Syria. Hollande begins his trip on the 24th with a visit to Washington, followed by talks in Moscow on the 26th of this month. France also formally requested European Union assistance in its fight against the group. British Prime Minister David Cameron said that he would present to Parliament a comprehensive strategy for tackling Daesh, including launching airstrikes against the group in Syria. Cameron told Parliament he wants to extend Britain's strike against the terrorist groups in Iraq to Syria to fall into line with allies, but fears a repeat of the defeat he suffered in Parliament in 2013 on plans to bomb the Syrian government forces. The leader of Britain's main opposition Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, opposes extending these strikes to Syria and has, according to local media, called on his party to follow his lead. Cameron will count on those Labour lawmakers opposed to their leader's stance and others to break ranks.
My firm conviction is that we need to act against ISIL in Syria. There is a compelling case for doing so. It is for the government, I accept, to make that case to this House and to the country. I can therefore announce that as a first important step to do so, I will respond personally to the report of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. I will set out our comprehensive strategy for dealing with ISIL, our vision for a more stable and peaceful Middle East. Now, this strategy, in my view, should include taking the action in Syria I've spoken about.
And speaking in Paris after talks with the French President and Foreign Minister, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said the United States is starting an operation with Turkey to finish securing the northern Syrian border, an area that Daesh terrorists have used as a lucrative smuggling route. He told reporters that 75% of the entire border of northern Syria has now been shut off and that the United States is entering an operation with the Turks to shut off the other remaining 98 kilometers of the border. The United States and Turkey hope that by sweeping Daesh from that border zone, they can deprive it of a smuggling route which has seen its ranks swell with foreign fighters and its coffers boosted by illicit trade. Kerry also said agreement reached last week at Vienna peace talks on Syria meant the country could be weeks away of a big transition and that now there's an opportunity to make a quick breakthrough. France continued raiding properties in the hunt for evidence and accomplices to Friday's Paris attack claimed by Daesh. Overnight, investigators and police conducted 128 raids and made arrests. France believed one of the attackers, Ismail Omar Mustafa, a criminal who never served time in jail, visited Syria in 2013 and 14. One top suspect, Belgian-born Frenchman Salah Abdel-Salam, 26, remains at large after escaping back to Belgium early on Saturday. French investigators believe the Paris attack may have been ordered by Abdelhamid Abbaoud, a Belgian national now living in Syria, where he has become an internet propagandist for Daesh under the name of Abu Omar al-Belgiki. Latest official figures estimate that 520 French nationals are in the Syrian and Iraqi war zones, including 116 women. Some 137 have died in the fighting, 250 have returned home, and around 700 have plans to travel to join the jihadi fractions. Daesh has followed its attacks on Paris with additional threats against other European capitals as well as the United States. This report attempts to provide an analysis of how the group is operating and what it takes to defeat it.
In the aftermath of Friday's attacks in Paris, a broader picture is emerging of the strategic goals of Islamic State in confronting its enemies outside Syria and Iraq. The group has already claimed responsibility for bringing down a Russian airliner in Egypt on November the 1st and has launched deadly suicide attacks in Turkey and Lebanon. But last week's assaults were by far the group's most audacious and sophisticated attacks on a Western target. Islamic State seems bent on punishing the forces that are attacking it on the ground in Syria, but Henri Baki of the Wilson Center in Washington says it's a strategy doomed to fail.
The more ISIS does Paris-like events or threatens, you're going to see that the determination to go after them is going to increase. In fact, this is the bravado of a 15-year-old who says, "Oh, I can do this. I did this. I can do this. That you should be afraid of me." But it is not A, not very smart, and B, I don't think it's that easy to do it.
Islamic State has followed up its Paris operation with a propaganda video, making additional threats against Europe and the United States. Despite its warning of an attack on Washington, Barki says the Paris attacks have strengthened the hand of President Obama in pursuing Islamic State with even more determination.
There's a window here where he has to be quite forceful and say to whomever, whether it's the Turks or the Saudis or the Qataris, look, this is our strategy, this is what we're going to do, and you're not going to interfere. You're going to help us, because there is going to be a price to pay if you don't.
Barki says Islamic State can be contained, but that a much broader and more determined effort will be required.
Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan gave Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu the mandate to form a new government following snap election earlier this month, in which the ruling AK party regained its parliamentary majority. Erdogan hopes the party's return to power after it briefly lost its majority in a June election will enable him to overhaul Turkey's constitution and set up a strong executive presidency. Davutoglu is expected to name his ministers tomorrow or Thursday, and observers say the government's priorities will be efficiency and reforms. Here at home, Prime Minister Abdullah Nsur discussed with Commander of the Turkish Air Force General Abdin Unal and his accompanying delegation means to boost cooperation and the exchange expertise through training programs between the two countries' air forces. The Turkish general highlighted the role played by Jordan to bring about peace and stability in the region and pointed to the repercussions of the Syrian crisis on both countries as they host millions of Syrian refugees. Yemen's exiled president Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi returned to the southern port city of Aden to rally forces loyal to him in the country's civil war and oversee a campaign to retake the city of Taz. It is his second return to Aden since the Saudi-led coalition retook the port city in July, but it was not clear how long he would stay or whether his visit would herald the permanent return of his administration from the Saudi capital. Medics in the city say more than 1,600 people have died there. In Saudi Arabia, flash floods caused by heavy rain have left at least 2 people dead in the city of Jeddah. The Saudi Civil Defense urged residents to stay indoors and said schools would remain closed tomorrow. The 2 deaths were caused by electrocution from a lamppost as people attempted to cross a flooded street. 2 children have also been reported missing in the north of the country. Heavy rain struck other western and northern and central parts of Saudi Arabia, including Mecca and Medina, Hail and Harar. And wet weather is forecast to continue in coming days. Cars from the latest James Bond movie, Spectre, are to go on display in London, marking the first UK exhibition of vehicles and probes from the film. The Cars of Spectre exhibition features James Bond's iconic Aston Martin DB10, but it's not only 007's car that stands out. The Jaguar CX-75, driven by the villainous Mr. Hinks in a high-speed chase with Bond through the streets of Rome, is also on display. The cars from Bond's 24th adventure will be joining the large official collection of 007 vehicle in the world, which features other iconic motors such as Bond's Aston Martin DB5 from GoldenEye, the Rolls-Royce Phantom 3 from Goldfinger, and the Wetnelly Lotus Esprit S1 from The Spy Who Loved Me.
Maybe disappear.
Why should I trust you?
Rafael Nadal's late-season resurgence continued at the ATP World Tour Final in London when he beat French Open champion Stanislas Wawrinka 6-3, 6-2. Nadal, back at the Tour Finals after missing out last year because of appendicitis surgery, dropped his opening service game to love but then broke Wawrinka as the first 9 points all went the way of the receiver. The Swiss blazed a forehand to fall 5-3 behind in the opener, and Nadal wrapped up the set with an ace. World number 4 Wawrinka offered precious little resistance after that, and his unforced error count climbed to 35 as Nadal raced to victory. Four days after the Paris attacks, England will host France in an international soccer friendly at Wembley this evening, and 2 teams of fans have already played a parallel match in a show of support. Following the attacks on Friday, there were calls from some quarters to postpone the national teams friendly in London, but in a show of unity, the French and English soccer associations decided the match would go ahead as scheduled. One of the English supporters said he hoped the game would show that sport can bring people together regardless of their background. And finally, it continues to be cold and cloudy for the rest of tonight, with scattered rain and southwesterly moderate to brisk winds. Tomorrow, relatively cold and partly cloudy conditions prevail in most regions, with a continued chance for light rain in the northern and central regions. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect fair conditions tomorrow, with northerly moderate winds and calm seas. Next are the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. And to end the news, here's a recap of our top stories. His Majesty holds talks in Kosovo, a country of Muslim majority, on ways to enhance bilateral ties and cooperation, especially in the fight against terror and promoting the values of moderation. President Vladimir Putin vows to punish those responsible for bringing down a Russian airliner over Sinai after proof of a bomb attack, and Russian forces intensify airstrikes against Daesh in Syria. And France continues raiding properties in the hunt for accomplices to Friday's Paris attacks. And the French presidency says François Hollande is to hold talks in Washington and Moscow next week. And with this we come to an end. I'm Farah Ajlouni. Thank you for watching and have a good night.